we'll go ahead and get started in the interest of time. I am Michelle Hoy-Watkins. Again, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I was asked by Mike to speak to you all today within the space of discussing my work as a threat assessment consultant. So many of you probably don't know this, but I was your director of threat assessment here at Northwestern between 2016 and 2020 until the pandemic hit, and I was the central point of contact in terms of assessing whether or not someone was at risk of violence on campus. And since that time, I currently serve as a threat assessment consultant for the Advocate Health System throughout the state of Illinois and for the University of Notre Dame. So I'm going to talk to you all about boots on the ground and what we can do as a community to help mitigate campus violence, and even for people who work in hospital space, what are some of the questions in terms of our assessment that we can ask in order to mitigate workplace violence? All right, so we've kind of heard a definition around behavioral threat assessment and management. Just to contextualize the definition that I'm using, which comes from the assessment of threat assessment in schools. Threat assessment is a systematic, fact-based approach for identification, assessment, and management that focuses on an individual who exhibits behavioral concerns and threat expressions towards members of their educational or workplace community. And one of the things that I really love about the research that was done by the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit is that they really legitimize the work that threat assessment teams are doing. And they indicated in the study that one of the things they found as one of the most preventative strategies was having a threat assessment team, as it was considered to be a very valuable, identifiable, preventable strategy in organizations. So having a threat assessment program, which Northwestern has, is a wonderful way to help mitigate violence. So I want to talk about regulatory considerations here in Illinois because it really sort of shapes the work that I do. And I think it's important that you all know legislatively what has been done here in Illinois. So the first thing is the Illinois Campus Security Enhancement Act of 2008. So after the tragedy of 3 individuals at Northern Illinois University, the Illinois Campus Security Enhancement Act was enacted, and the goal is to develop an interdisciplinary or multi-jurisdictional campus violence prevention plan, including coordination and communication among all available campus, local mental health, and first response resources. And so what that really did was to say that we want to develop partnerships on campuses, but also with community-based resources. And there's been a lot of advances that have come of that. And one of those things was specifically, it required that the campus violence prevention plan shall include the development and implementation of a campus violence prevention committee, but that all college campuses, state of Illinois, are required to have assessment teams. So I'm not sure if people know that, but if you are working within a college campus space in the state of Illinois, it is a requirement, and that is a huge legislative win for our state. The Illinois bill that recently was approved, so 2003, amended the School Safety Drill Act of August of 2019, and it requires that all school boards and all school districts, so we're talking K through 12, are required to develop a threat assessment protocol and to create threat assessment teams. It provides that a threat assessment protocol adopted by the school board shall be public. It's a public document that should be made available to parents, to teachers, and to students. And it provides that the school district may share information concerning a clear and present danger with another school district and create conforming exemptions in the Illinois School Student Records Act. So that's a major win because we think about HIPAA in the work that we do. And so what this act specifically says is that if we become aware that a student or even a staff member presents with a clear and present danger, that we have legal permission to share that information. And that is a major preventative strategy. It also creates exemptions for the work of the Threat Assessment Team in the Open Meetings Act and Freedom of Information Act. Also, I think what is really important and a part of the work that I'm going to talk to you all today about is just how do we do this work in a space that considers the impact of violence on individuals' emotional and psychological functioning. So doing this work in a way that is trauma informed. And again, this act specifically requires that K through 12 schools conduct in-service training for all school districts on the methods to respond to trauma at least once every 2 years. So every staff member, every, parents are also a part of the invitation to these types of meetings, but training faculty and staff on what are the warning signs of mental health, trauma, and suicidal behavior. Training staff on appropriate intervention and referral techniques. So what are some of the strategies that they need to be aware of in order to intervene when they have a student who's presenting with those concerning behaviors that we just learned about? What are the appropriate community-based referral techniques and strategies that are available to staff and faculty in school systems to provide that continuity of care? Recognition of and care for trauma in students and in staff. And so again, the impact of what we see on television, again, you don't have to directly experience a trauma to be traumatized by an experience. And so every time we turn on the TV and we see that yet another school or another business has been, violently impacted, that is traumatic for us as well. So we want to recognize that in terms of the work that we are doing in the educational system. Another great thing about this trauma act is that it takes into account the relationship between the educator's wellness and student learning. So the impact that, a faculty member in terms of their own personal wellness and the stress, that some of this work brings. And so they talk about that in terms of the training, the effect of trauma on student behavior and learning, and the prevalence of trauma among student populations at higher risk of experiencing trauma. So what does that student population look like? We'll talk about biopsychosocial factors and how that impacts students, and then the effects of implicit and explicit bias on recognizing trauma among various student groups in connection with race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, SES, and other relevant factors. So what are those factors as well? So in the hospital space, when I do work, there is a similar definition, but some things that are unique to this. Workplace violence is an act of threat, of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at a work site. And specifically, it ranges from threats or verbal abuse to physical assaults and even homicide. It can affect and involve employees, clients, customers, and visitors. So as we know, in a hospital space, healthcare workers are, just at an increasing rate. They're 5 times more likely to experience a workplace violence event as compared to other workers. And so this is a growing area in terms of workplace violence. It requires that all violent threats and incidents be investigated. So OSHA in this policy says that anytime we have a nurse, a technician, a physician that is threatened, we are required to investigate that threat in order to mitigate that violence in a hospital space. There are 4 types, I didn't put this on here, but there are 4 types of violence that we investigate in those typologies. Type 1 violence is someone who has absolutely sort of no relationship with the hospital. Type 2 violence is patient to healthcare worker. Type 3 violence is worker on worker, what we call teammate violence. And then the 4th is usually domestic violence. And so what do you think is the most common type of violence in a healthcare space? You think it's type 1, type 2, type 3, or type 4? 2. Type 2. You shouldn't have been allowed to answer that. It's type 2 violence. So it's this patient on healthcare workers. And sometimes it's, it's frustration. Sometimes it's the stress of dealing with a health issue. Sometimes it's being upset about a loved one who they may have recently lost. And so that's what we are seeing in those spaces. So according to a recent study published on the frequency of workplace violence against healthcare workers, 34% reported verbal or physical workplace violence incident. So 34% reported a verbal or a physical workplace violence incident. And of that 34%, 60% of them displayed at least one symptom or sign of PTSD. Okay, so trauma is really important in terms of doing this work. So we heard a little bit about behavioral threat assessment from Dr. Alathari's presentation, and just to sort of double down on some of that, we want to use multiple sources of data, including published research. So all of the work that we do is evidence-based. It's based on what has been studied. It's based on all of the risk factors, some of the enhancers, some of the mitigating factors that we've learned today. We want to make sure that we are considering all of those multiple sources of data, and I'll talk about some of those things we can do. But we want to focus on an individual's patterns of thinking and behavior to determine if the person of concern is on a pathway towards violence. And we'll look at what that pathway looks like. And then we're also concerned with assessing risk of targeted or predatory violence. So oftentimes, I'll say in university space, you have a student that's upset because they didn't get a certain grade. And so we consider that to be more of emotional or affective violence. But when someone begins to develop a grievance, and when someone begins to, post on social media, and there are things that are sort of out of characteristic for what is considered to be sort of baseline frustration around a poor grade, that's when we become concerned as threat assessors. So threat assessment principles we want to consider is that corroboration is very important. I once had a case where a student posted, he responded to, I guess it was a survey for Residence Life, and the comment was, is it okay to sit in the dorm and make pipe bombs? So it's not a, very smart thing to say on a survey when you're entering into a university space. And so what that resulted in us having to contact our FBI liaison to assess, first of all, who is this individual? Is he on your radar? We had to do a direct interview with that individual, and what he said was that he was just joking. That resulted in me contacting his last university, outreaching to his parents, checking his social media. So we want to corroborate multiple sources of data. So it's knowledge-based. It's not just on hearsay. We want to investigate that. Multidisciplinary collaboration is essential. So what our threat assessment teams look like in a university space may look a little bit different in the hospital space. So residential life. Do we have someone from the provost office who can speak to if we have a faculty or staff issue? Do we have legal on our team? We also want to think about the dean of students, the counseling center. So multidisciplinary, we want multiple lenses investigating and providing perspective on a particular case. Early identification is the key to helping to mitigate violence on campus and in workplaces. So the minute that you become aware of any type of concern, the sooner you report that information, the sooner individuals that do this work can intervene. Multiple reporting options I talked a little bit about. Again, it's trauma-informed interventions and must be flexible. So on the spectrum of, and it'll come up here in just a second, of the pathway towards violence, it's a very fluid process. It's very dynamic. So sometimes we have to shift in terms of our intervention strategies. So we have to be nimble in our approach. And the community shares a responsibility, which I'll touch on. And so these are just some recommendations also based on Lee Malloy and Steve White's work in assessing workplace and campus violence with the waiver. And the waiver is the workplace assessment of violence risk. It's a tool that I don't always have time to sit down and use, but I integrate those principles within my work. And so understanding threat assessment. It is the process of gathering information for use of making decisions that will address why and how a person formed their violent goals, their intentions and plans, the extent to which the violent goals, intentions, and plans are stable or not, and then how to best interrupt the goals, intentions, and plans. And so this is at This is at the back of the mind of every threat assessment that I do, that our teams do. So why trauma informed, and what does that really mean? So it's a holistic approach to understanding an individual. We want to know everything we can historically about the individual. What was their childhood like? Does this person have a history of domestic violence? Are there issues in terms of their own personal relationships? Are there any concerns in terms of their work? Are there cultural factors that we need to be aware of? There's a lot going on in the world culturally. How does that impact that individual's functioning? What are those biopsychosocial stressors that we've already heard about? But what's their social functioning? What are the things that help in terms of their coping mechanisms and so forth? It also recognizes the impact that trauma has on an individual. So if I'm working with a victim, someone who has been threatened, then I want to understand, how concerned is this person about the threat? How worried are they? So we'll always ask them, how threatened do you feel? Do you experience fear in response to the threat that has been made? How has that impacted them from a trauma lens? Is it reshaping how they engage in their daily activity? So is this person now wanting an escort to their car? So those kinds of questions are really important. It also focuses on minimizing risk of harm or re-traumatization. So we do want to ask questions in a way so that we aren't causing the person to feel re-traumatized. And I'll give you some examples of specific questions. It promotes well-being and recovery. So we want to see in every case, whether it is the person of concern, whether it is the victim, that we are providing resources that will restore them to recovery. Because oftentimes in the space that I work, we're not talking about people who have engaged or will necessarily engage in mass murder. We're talking about a student. We're talking about a patient. And oftentimes the people that I work with at some point, whether they are hospitalized or whether they get some type of community resource, they go back into the community with us. So recovery is really key to the process of the work that I do. So the first thing is important of establishing rapport and trust. So having conversations with people who engage in these kinds of conversations, these kinds of behaviors is sometimes difficult, to sort of break the ice. So the first thing I want to do is I want to have a conversation, a space that feels comfortable. Sometimes I do this work in campus police departments. And so usually there is sort of a trauma room where domestic violence interviews take place. But if that resource is not available, we want to try to find a place on campus that is comfortable just to establish that rapport. Consider the time of day. If this incident happens, at 11 p.m., is it better to let that individual get some rest and come back in the morning and have that conversation? What's the location? What's the setting? What are the advantages or disadvantages to doing the work in the moment? So again, from a trauma lens, how is that going to impact the individual? The CDC and OSHA provide 6 guiding principles to trauma-informed approach. And the first one is safety. At the end of the day, everybody wants to go home. So safety is the most important, I think, factor that we're all dealing with. Trustworthiness and transparency. So having, sort of honest conversations with people about, what to expect. Peer support. When I work in the hospital setting, we are working with peer support officers. I work again at Advocate, and so they have peer support team members who specifically sit down with teammates who have experienced some type of threat. Collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice, and choice, and giving the victim the power to have conversations about their experience. And then cultural, historical, and gender issues I spoke about, but this is sort of their guide in terms of trauma-informed approach. So what are some of the specific screening questions? Again, we're always concerned about imminent risk of violence. That is always going to be our first question. So assess for violence, risk of harm to oneself, others, and property. Does the person have a history of trauma? If the person has a history of domestic violence, I specifically want to ask that victim, who at work knows, who do you feel comfortable sharing information with? Let's identify one person, whether that is your supervisor, whether that is someone in public safety, whether that's someone in EAP. Do you have a safe word? If that individual comes on campus, or if you're at home and you are not safe, what is your safe word? Who is that person that you can call? And we hear that word and we know to call the police. So some specific domestic violence questions that we would ask. Same thing for sexual trauma and history of sexual violence. Also, in terms of assessing for trauma, we want to know about prior threats or violence, and that's predictive of future risk of violence. And so if I'm talking to a person of concern, I want to know if he's ever engaged in these types of behaviors before, because it tells me a little bit about what to expect. Has the person been exposed to or witnessed any type of traumatic event before? And some of the trauma-related or other mental health symptoms, I want to specifically ask if they are starting to experience any symptoms of trauma. How's your sleep? Are you having any bad dreams? Are you having persistent, recurrent, thoughts about this? And so again, while diagnosis is secondary as a threat assessment principle, is secondary to threat assessment, it informs the recovery process. So if I know that I'm working with a victim who is starting to experience some psychological symptoms, that helps me in terms of my intervention strategy. Now I'm making a recommendation for that person to get connected to EAP. Same thing goes for if I'm talking to a person of concern. Had a student recently who moved in next door to an ex-girlfriend, bought a semi-automatic rifle and posted a picture holding it and sent her a text message and said, I bought a gun and it has your name on it. Very alarming and very concerning. I reached out to, he had one contact with the college campus counselor, talked to the counselor, talked to a psychiatrist that he had seen one time. He went in saying that he thought he needed help, but was feeling uncertain as to why. And two of the things that sort of aligned in terms of those only individual contacts at each source was that they both said that he reported that he felt that other people could hear his thoughts. And so when I heard that, I said, this person is having or sort of an early onset of a psychotic break. And in the midst of literally, as I'm writing the report, I get a call from the counseling center director of threat assessment who said, she didn't say stop writing, but what she told me was that the night before, the same individual had bought another weapon, was attempting to buy another weapon when the police showed up. The individual, the victim, was tracking his phone, still had the ability to track his phone, and found out that he was at another gun shop. And so again, very alarming. But having conversations with multiple sources are really important in terms of our safety plan and our threat management recommendation. The point I wanted to make for this individual, the recommendation was for him to be hospitalized. So we're also trying to provide restorative care even for the person of concern. So I mentioned cultural considerations. Substance abuse is really important. The individual that I spoke about talked a lot about, he was vaping drugs through his vape. He talked about doing ecstasy. He talked about drinking alcohol. He talked about abusing prescription pills. And so again, it's a risk factor for violence, especially when I know all of these other things that he's done. So assess for history of substance use, and then obviously social support acts as a mitigating factor. And so who are those people? Is it clergy? Is it family? Is it the counseling center? Is it a friend? How do we engage those people as our threat partners? I threw this in here because it comes from a book that I rely on heavily, and it's a book by Jane Dysinger, who's actually a police psychologist, but he was the chief of police at Virginia Tech at the time of the tragedy. Marissa Randazzo and their colleagues, the Handbook of Campus Threat Assessment. If you want to know how to do this work in a campus space, to me, this is a go-to. This is a must-have book. But what this recommends very early on is that we do a pre-screening and we identify the person of concern. We conduct an initial screening. If it is an imminent situation, we are immediately contacting law enforcement. I'm no longer involved at that point in terms of the screening process. If it is a no, we're at the inquiry phase and we are assessing based on some of the questions that I'm going to share in just a second. Is there a concern? If it's no, then we close the case. If there is a concern, it poses a threat. Is the person in need of help? If yes, we're making a referral for intervention, and we're gonna refer and do follow-up and then close out. Does the person pose a threat? Yes, develop and implement a plan, monitor the plan, refer for follow-up, and close the case. So again, the arrows kind of go both ways because it's a fluid, very dynamic process. BTAM, Behavioral Threat Assessment and Management Meetings. So what do those meetings actually look like? Again, multidisciplinary. The first meeting is what we call discovery and alignment. We want to hear from everyone on that call, any facts related to the threat expression or the behavior. Okay, so we want to make sure that anyone who has some information about the case is joining that call so that we can have multiple lines of sight on the situation. We want to know who is the intended target, who is the person of interest, what is the relationship, when we heard before about grievances. So what is the particular grievance and how can we sort of get in that space and mitigate the grievance? We heard about the pathway towards violence. And so this comes from Calhoun and Weston's contemporary threat guide. And so again, fluid, right? Escalation, de-escalation. So it starts with a grievance. The person is upset because they're being separated. They've worked for, the company for 20 years and they don't feel valued. And even within the space of recognizing the trauma of separation, there's certain questions that we want to ask. But does that form into violent ideation? Is there a decision at that point to begin to research and plan and attack? The student that I talked to you all about, was his move next door that he says was coincidental? Was that part of his research plan, how to get closer to, his ex-girlfriend? The pre-attack and preparation, going to the shooting range, purchasing a weapon is all a part of the pre-attack preparation. The probing and the breaching. The day I was writing the report and I got a call saying he was in the parking lot the night before, is this person planning to attack? The breach, meaning has this person posted on social media? He sent her a direct message saying, I have a gun and it's got your name on it. That to me would be considered a breach. He's articulating some expression of intent to do harm, and then the attack. So we want to get in here before obviously something like that. Trauma-informed questions, and I feel like I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be quick. There's a number of different questions we want to ask, and some of them may include, has the PRI suffered a major loss in love or in life? Is the PRI angry, humiliated? Does the person blame you for something specific? Okay, sometimes it's a matter of resolving the grievance. I've seen in hospital spaces where people are very upset with billing. A couple of people I've worked with in billing were directly threatened and fear for their life because the person didn't want to pay the bill. And I've seen hospitals say, hey, get rid of the bill, the person will go away. And that's, in that case, happens. But how can we mitigate the grievance? Okay. Does a POI currently feel a sense of desperation or despair? Has a POI attempted suicide in the past? That's important to know. Has a POI ever hurt you, threatened you, or others, or made you afraid, or forced you to do something that you didn't want to do prior to this incident? Other important questions. Are you or anyone else concerned or in fear of your personal safety because of the POI's behavior? Document the specific fear. What are the levels of fear and what's the reasons for it? Is there a threat expression related to domestic violence or intimate partner violence? Does the POI have a history of such? Some of these, I feel like, what actions could make the situation worse? So if we call the student today and tell them that the decision of the threat assessment team is a dismissal, what mitigation strategies do we need to put in place? Because if you're telling me that's what we're going to do, we now have to provide trauma-informed support for this student. Okay, so let's call the hospital. If the goal is to have them transferred to hospital, let's do that. But what actions can make it worse? And then what events can make the POI commit violence? What are those triggers? This goes on. I'm happy to share with Mike and he can get this out to you guys. But I want to talk about after event psychological first aid. So after the person has been, you know, threatened, or if there's some behavior that has occurred, does the victim experience that fear? Does the victim show signs or expressions or symptoms of trauma? I feel like I may have repeated that, but OSHA recommends a stress debrief session and PTSD counseling services. We also recommend in a workplace space, EAP counseling. In a university space, oftentimes we're sending students to the counseling center. A referral for behavioral health treatment, community management intervention, and then other mitigation or intervention strategies. It might be a medical leave of absence from school or from work. It could be seeking a restraining order. It could be an arrest. It could be a fitness for duty. There's lots of intervention strategies that we put in place. It could be a direct violence risk assessment from a consultant. And I think this may be my last couple of slides. Examining student reporting of concerning behaviors. I want to share this one. This is the work that was done by Dr. Galora out of the University of Nebraska. He examined 1,000 students, awareness of threatening or concerning behaviors, response behaviors, and reasons for acting or failing to report concerning behaviors. He wanted to understand, why are people reporting or not reporting concerning behaviors? And what he found was there was a 12% report rate of the 1,000 students. 44% made an informal or some type of informal response was the most common. So not calling an official person. And the reasons for not taking actions, there was no desire to be involved. This is what they described, or they perceived that it was unlikely to be an imminent dangerous situation. For those that did report, they were more likely to notify the police or university authority. They had an awareness of campus resources so that they knew that there was a threat assessment team that they could go to, and they perceived imminent risk and that it was likely to cause harm. Well, my pretty little circle there isn't working, but what this says is that shared responsibility. I want to leave you with that every person in this room has a responsibility to see something and say something, right? We hear that all the time. Underreporting is probably the biggest barrier to mitigating violence in workplace and campus spaces. So we have to feel comfortable reporting. Early reporting equals early intervention. Reporting allows for access to resources and a restorative approach. I sat and did a training for Greek life. And one person in the audience says, well, I'm not going to tell on my frat brother, code of fraternity life. And so I said, it's an issue of making sure that we all stay safe at the end of the day. So it's not about getting anyone in trouble. It's really a restorative approach. Create community awareness. Marketing campaigns. I saw a flyer with my name still on it in the elevator. So make sure that we are getting the information out there that we do have a threat assessment program. And these are the multiple forms of mechanisms to report information. Be an upstander. Make sure that you feel comfortable enough to say something. Don't ignore it, because it's possible, based on social psychology, that no one is reported at all. So be an upstander. Community partnerships, we have to break silos. So Dr. Alathari, who I saw maybe 6 years ago, if I have a question or if I want her to present, I'm contacting her. I'm contacting community resources. We have to break silos because, again, we're all a part of the community. And then follow-up documentation. I can't tell you how much documentation and case management is important. But as we heard earlier today, these cases sometimes are 10 years long. And so the follow-up case management part of this is critical. We always want to have line of sight on a person of concern. So the follow-up is important. I will stop talking and I will turn it back over to you.